History remembers kings, conquerors, and the victorious. But what about those it tries to erase? What about the sons born to rule, only to be cast aside, buried beneath time? Before Victor Hugo gave us the Hunchback of Notre Dame, before Quasimodo rang his bells in lonely exile, there was another hunchback, one history tried to forget. A real one, a prince, the rightful heir to the greatest empire of the Middle Ages. His name was Pepin, the firstborn son of Charlemagne, the man who should have worn the crown. Instead, he was abandoned, imprisoned, and wiped from memory. But why? Was it truly because of his deformity? Or was there something far more sinister at play? Part 1. The Rise of Charlemagne, a kingdom forged in blood. Charlemagne, king of the Franks, was not merely a ruler, he was a force of nature. His empire stretched from the North Sea to the Pyrenees, encompassing modern-day France, Germany, and beyond. He was crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 800 AD, a moment that would define the future of Europe. But this title was not freely given. It was an act of political desperation. Pope Leo III, threatened by Roman nobility and in dire need of a powerful ally, placed the crown upon Charlemagne's head in St. Peter's Basilica. With that single gesture, the Frankish king became the supreme protector of Christendom. But protection came at a cost. Under Charlemagne's rule, Europe was unified under Christianity, not through peaceful conversion, but by the blade. The Saxons of northern Germany resisted, refusing to abandon their old gods. Charlemagne's response was ruthless. At the massacre of Verdun in 782, he ordered the execution of 4,500 Saxons in a single day. Entire villages were burned, their inhabitants either forcibly baptized or slaughtered. To him, unity in faith meant obedience. A divided people could not be governed. Christianity was not just a religion, it was a weapon. But if Charlemagne could reshape an empire with fire and steel, why couldn't he shape his own family? But even the mightiest rulers cannot escape the unpredictability of fate. And fate had delivered Charlemagne a son who was never meant to inherit the throne. Part 2. The Cursed Heir, Pepin the Hunchback's Birthright. For all his triumphs, Charlemagne could not control fate, and fate had cursed his firstborn son. Pepin the Hunchback was the rightful heir to the Carolingian Empire, yet from birth his future was uncertain. His twisted spine marked him as an anomaly, a weakness in a dynasty built on war and dominance. In medieval Europe, a deformity was more than a physical ailment. It was a sign of divine disfavor. How could a man chosen by God rule over an empire if his own body betrayed him? The Franks had a brutal history of deposing weak rulers, and Charlemagne knew it. His empire demanded strength, demanded that its ruler be seen as a warrior blessed by heaven. Pepin's body, bent and imperfect, made him vulnerable not only to the scorn of his father, but to the political vultures waiting to see who would inherit Charlemagne's legacy. Would the empire accept a ruler who did not look the part? Pepin was raised in Aachen, a city that was the very heart of Charlemagne's empire. The Palace of Aachen, later home to the Palatine Chapel, was a grand structure, built in the style of Byzantine and Roman architecture, with soaring arches, marble columns, and a throne raised high above the halls. It was a place of power, where warriors, clergymen, and scholars walked its halls, debating the fate of kingdoms. And yet, within these walls, the rightful heir was being quietly pushed aside. Part 3. The Silent Exile, Pepin's Childhood in Aachen. Pepin was surrounded by warriors, scholars, and the political elite of the empire, yet he was never truly among them. His half-brothers, Louis the Pious, Charles, and Pepin of Italy, were groomed for power, trained in war, and prepared for rulership. Meanwhile, Pepin was kept at a distance. He was not trained to command armies. He was not taught the strategies of war. Instead, he was placed under the tutelage of monks, his education rooted in religion rather than governance. This was no accident. It was a quiet erasure, a rewriting of the future before it could unfold. A medieval ruler had to be strong. A king who could not fight was no king at all. Pepin's own father saw him as unworthy. But did Pepin accept this fate? Did he resign himself to a life of prayer and silence? No. Unlike Quasimodo, Pepin did not submit to exile. He refused to be erased, and soon he would take matters into his own hands. Part 4. A rebellion in the shadows. Power in the Carolingian Empire was not inherited, it was seized. Pepin watched as his younger brothers were handed the future that should have been his. He listened to the whispers of discontented nobles, men who had grown resentful of Charlemagne's centralization of power. Some sought influence, others sought vengeance, but all saw in Pepin an opportunity. In 792, a conspiracy took shape. Pepin and his allies plotted to overthrow Charlemagne and claim the throne. This was not the desperate act of a bitter son. It was a calculated move. He had gathered a network of nobles who believed the empire should belong to him. And yet, conspiracies are fragile things, built on whispers and sustained by loyalty. And loyalty, in a world ruled by power, was an unstable currency. Before Pepin could act, a traitor within his ranks delivered word to Charlemagne. The rebellion was over before it even began. But what would happen next was far worse than execution. Part 5. A fate. Worse than death, the Abbey of Prum. Charlemagne's punishment was not swift. He did not grant his son the dignity of a warrior's death. No, he chose something far crueler: erasure. Pepin was stripped of everything, his name erased from royal succession. He was sent to the Abbey of Prum, a monastery deep in the forests of what is now Western Germany. It was a place of silence, prayer, and isolation. But make no mistake, this was not an act of mercy. This was a prison in all but name. The abbey itself was a cold, towering structure, built with thick Romanesque stone that swallowed light and sound. Its walls, damp with centuries of candle smoke and incense, housed monks who lived by the rule of Saint Benedict, a life of silence and ceaseless toil. Pepin, once destined to command legions, now spent his days copying scripture by candlelight. His hands, meant to wield a sword, were now stained with ink. Part 6. The Prison of Prum. Pepin's life in the abbey. Pepin's exile to Prum was more than just a political punishment. It was a sentence of isolation, a slow and deliberate erasure of his identity. The Abbey of Prum, nestled deep in the forests of what is now Western Germany, was a monastic stronghold designed for quiet contemplation and rigid discipline. The thick Romanesque walls loomed high, built not for grandeur, but for endurance, trapping its inhabitants in an existence dictated by silence and devotion. This was no grand palace of learning or theological debate. It was a place where time stood still, where voices were hushed, and where men came not to rule, but to disappear. Inside the abbey, Pepin was stripped of all remnants of his former life. Gone were the embroidered robes of a prince, the gold-threaded tunics of the Carolingian court. He now wore the simple woolen habit of a Benedictine monk, rough, scratchy, and deliberately plain. The only warmth came from the dim candlelight flickering off the damp stone walls, casting long, ghostly shadows that followed him wherever he walked. Days at Prum followed an unbreakable rhythm, set not by personal will, but by the toll of the church bells. At the first light of dawn, before the sun had even begun to break through the misty forests surrounding the abbey, Pepin and the other monks would rise for matins, the first of 7 daily prayers. In the dim chapel, their voices merged into slow, monotonous chants, their breath visible in the cold air, each word a plea for salvation that Pepin himself may have found hollow. Had God abandoned him? Or was this exile meant to be some cruel form of penance? After prayer, there was labor. Unlike the luxury of Charlemagne's court, where servants attended to every need, life in the monastery was built upon self-sufficiency. Pepin, once destined to command armies, now spent his hours toiling in the fields. The monks cultivated wheat, barley, and vegetables, their hands dirtied with the same soil that kings once bled over in battle. He hauled sacks of grain, chopped firewood for the abbey's hearths, and carried water from the well, tasks fit for a peasant, not a prince. The weight of such work must have been brutal on his already twisted spine. Every morning, as he bent over to lift another bundle of firewood, did he curse his father? Did he curse the body that had doomed him? When not laboring in the fields, Pepin would have spent hours in the abbey's scriptorium, one of the few places where he could interact with the outside world, albeit in the most limited sense. Monasteries were the keepers of knowledge in medieval Europe, preserving religious and historical texts that might otherwise have been lost. Here, he was tasked with copying scripture, his fingers stained with ink instead of blood. Each word he transcribed onto parchment was an echo of someone else's thoughts, someone else's decrees. He wrote about kings and warriors, yet he himself would never be remembered as one. He meticulously illuminated the pages with intricate gold leaf designs, his calligraphy precise, yet every stroke of the quill served as a cruel reminder. His own story was being erased while he preserved the legacies of others. The silence was perhaps the worst of all. The rule of Saint Benedict, which dictated monastic life, forbade unnecessary speech. Conversation was a luxury rarely indulged in, except for essential tasks. There were no debates, no battle plans, no whispered conspiracies. The only sound was the scrape of quills on parchment, the distant ringing of bells, and the solemn hymns sung in the candle-lit chapel. What did Pepin think about in those endless moments of solitude? Did he relive his failed rebellion in his mind, wondering how history might have changed if one traitor had remained silent? Did he still believe he had been meant to rule? Or had the years worn down his resolve, turning his ambition into nothing more than a distant echo? At night, Pepin would retreat to his small stone cell, more akin to a prison than a royal chamber. There was no grand four-poster bed draped in fine silks, no roaring fire to ward off the cold. Instead, a simple wooden cot, a rough woolen blanket, and a small wooden cross were all he had. As the wind howled outside, carrying whispers of the world he once belonged to, did he still dream of the throne, or did he dream of nothing at all? The years passed in this way, one identical to the last. Outside the monastery walls, the empire he was meant to rule thrived under the governance of his younger brother, Louis the Pious. The name Pepin became nothing more than a whisper, spoken only in the margins of history. Charlemagne had succeeded in making his son disappear, not by the sword, but through silence. And yet, history does not always bend to the will of kings. The deeper Pepin faded, the more he became something else, not a ruler, not a prince, but a legend. For in trying to erase him, Charlemagne had unknowingly ensured that his son would be remembered, not as a conqueror, but as a question left unanswered. Part 7. The Echoes of a Forgotten Prince. Pepin the Hunchback was supposed to be king. He was Charlemagne's firstborn, the rightful heir to an empire that stretched across Europe. But history is cruel to those who do not fit its vision of power. His spine was bent, and so the world bent his fate along with it. His crime, being born imperfect in the eyes of kings. His punishment, a lifetime of silence. And yet, despite Charlemagne's efforts, Pepin's name was never completely lost. Whispers of his failed rebellion lingered in medieval chronicles. The margins of forgotten texts still spoke of the prince who might have been. And centuries later, another hunchbacked figure would emerge, Quasimodo, the outcast hidden in the bell tower of Notre Dame. History is written by the victors, and Charlemagne, the great emperor, the unifier of Europe, wrote his own version of events. But in trying to erase his own son, he ensured that Pepin would always remain a shadow in history, a question left unanswered. And sometimes, being forgotten makes a man immortal in ways the crowned rulers of history never could be. History isn't just the story of kings and empires. It's the story of those lost in the margins, the ones history tried to erase. But as we've seen, some names refuse to be forgotten. Pepin the Hunchback was supposed to be a ghost, a failed prince buried in silence. And yet, here we are, uncovering his story, pulling him from the shadows of history. If you've made it this far, you already know there's always more beneath the surface. So if you want to keep digging up the lost, the hidden, the untold, hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment, tell me your thoughts, because history is never finished, and the deeper we go, the more we realize how much has been buried.